Our story begins with a man named Ahai, who helped his uncle run a seafood wholesale business that cleared a net profit of $2.85 million in a single year. But when the year-end bonus arrived, his uncle tossed him a mere $120,000, claiming that since he provided the stall and the capital, $120,000 for labor was plenty. Ahai didn't say a word. He simply pocketed the bonus, which wasn't even a fraction of what he earned, and agreed to his uncle's terms. His uncle assumed he was a fool who would remain cheap labor forever, little knowing that Ahai used that money to lease the massive cold storage right across from him. Seeing his uncle's face turn pale, Ahai simply told him they would go their separate ways from now on. That night, his uncle sat alone and smashed his calculator in a rage. We see the reality of the numbers: $2.85 million in a year. For 365 days, they had worked in shifts without rest. They watched over the seafood tanks constantly, reaching a total turnover of over $5 million, with a net profit just shy of $2.9 million. The uncle insisted on the figure of $2.85 million, reminding Ahai that the stall and the initial investment were all his doing. He even claimed credit for the restaurant connections, telling Ahai that he was nothing more than a pair of hired hands. As the uncle continued, he told Ahai not to look at him that way, arguing that a common laborer would only make $10,000 a month at most. He claimed that after food, housing, and insurance, this $120,000 was a generous pure profit. To be honest, Ahai had already done the math himself. He had personally handled every purchase, loss, and collection. Even those broken refrigerators had cost him over $30,000 in repairs out of his own pocket. The uncle was technically right about the capital, but he refused to acknowledge how much of that $2.73 million was earned through Ahai's literal blood and sweat. Ahai simply nodded and agreed, while his uncle, perhaps feeling a flicker of guilt, told him not to overthink things. He told Ahai there was a shipment of premium lobsters arriving at the port soon and to get there early. Ahai didn't go home that night, the cash still in his pocket. He was afraid his mother would ask how much he earned with his uncle or how they split the profits. He simply had no way to tell her the truth. It broke down to 328 yuan a day. When they first started, his uncle had promised they would split everything as family, 50-50. He had promised that if he had a bite to eat, Ahai would have one too. Before the new year, it was a half split. After the new year, it was just labor. Ahai stared at that number for a long time, realizing this was the price his uncle put on a year of his life. If the stall belonged to the uncle, so be it. He decided then and there to create something of his own, calling the market manager to inquire about the 500 square meter space right across the way. A first-class cold storage lease plus deposit would cost at least $120,000, and he had already spent a year building deep connections with the local retailers. If he could sign the contract within 3 days, he would be able to open his own stall before the new year. The moment he held that money, Ahai knew his fate was no longer in someone else's hands. At 4 a.m. on New Year's Day, the pier was freezing. The wind was bone-chilling, but he arrived 2 hours earlier than usual. As soon as the boat docked, he approached the captain immediately. He told old Zhang he wanted the entire batch of premium lobsters, paid in cash on the spot. The captain hesitated, noting that Ahai's uncle had already called. Ahai pulled out a stack of cash, explaining he was working for himself now and offering 5% above the market price, handling all the labor himself. He promised the captain wouldn't have to wait a single minute. Old Zhang remained silent for a few seconds before finally nodding his head in agreement. By the time the uncle arrived at the pier, that batch of premium lobsters had already been loaded into Ahai's cold chain truck. Standing on the empty pier, his uncle's face turned livid as he demanded to know what Ahai was doing. Ahai simply closed the truck door. He reminded his uncle of their agreement to go separate ways, saying he needed a good start for the new year. As he drove off, his uncle's figure shrank. In the rearview mirror, he saw the bridge between them burn. He took the lobsters to his cold storage and worked through the night to sort them. The quality was exceptional. Each lobster weighed over 1.5 pounds with full meat and intact antennae. He sorted them by size into different crates. He used ice water to keep them fresh, ensuring a zero mortality rate. At 5 a.m., he sent a mass message to all the retail vendors in the market. Within half an hour, over a dozen people had gathered at the cold storage door. These were the connections he had spent the last year cultivating. He had helped many of them through hard times, and they remembered those favors clearly. After inspecting the goods, the retailers began placing orders. He sold them at the standard market price without any markup or hoarding. In just 2 hours, the entire batch of lobsters was completely cleared out. He had made a net profit of $43,000. With his first capital recovered, Haiji Aquatic Cold Storage was officially open for business. At 10 a.m., his uncle called, but Ahai didn't answer. Soon, rumors began to spread through the market that Ahai had broken away to start his own stall. The uncle put out the word. Anyone who dared to do business with Ahai would never get another shipment from him again. People wondered how Ahai could survive after offending his uncle. By noon, retailers began calling one by one to cancel their future orders. The vendors sounded troubled, claiming family emergencies prevented them from stocking up. Ahai understood the situation perfectly and simply returned their deposits without a word. At 3 p.m., his uncle arrived with several veteran stall owners from the market, blocking the entrance to the cold storage. He pointed a finger directly at Ahai's face. He called him an ungrateful wolf, shouting that he had brought him from the countryside and taught him the business hand-to-hand, only to be repaid with betrayal. As a crowd of onlookers gathered to watch the drama, Ahai didn't argue about the stolen 120,000. He simply asked, quite calmly, what his uncle wanted. Choked by the question, the uncle finally spat out a threat, claiming that no boat captain or major client in the market would dare do business with him. He told Ahai to wait for his inevitable bankruptcy before turning to leave, the other stall owners following closely behind him like a loyal shadow. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind a trail of whispers that echoed through the air. Ahai stood at the cold storage entrance, watching them go. He watched their retreating backs with complete indifference. After a year of grinding in this market, he knew every boat's schedule and every pier's rhythm. He knew exactly what every small retailer needed better than anyone. His uncle thought he had cut off his lifeline, but he was mistaken about how loyalty works. Real relationships are built with effort, not maintained through threats. That night, he hung his sign, Haiji Aquatic Wholesale, 5 bold characters for all to see. It sat directly opposite his uncle's stall, glowing piercingly under the night lights. He also posted a notice at the market entrance for a new position. He was hiring a sorter for $12,000 a month, including room, board, and insurance, with a year-end bonus for good performance. A generous offer, to be sure. The next morning, a young man named Xiao Lin came to apply. He had just arrived from his hometown, his eyes filled with a familiar, hungry ambition. Ahai looked at the boy's calloused hands and saw a hard worker. He hired him on the spot, telling him to start that very afternoon. After Xiao Lin left, we see Ahai back in the cold storage taking inventory. The refrigerator hummed loudly as the temperature display stabilized. The screen held steady at -5 degrees. He stared across at his uncle's stall, which was brightly lit and bustling with people, for now. It looked like a thriving business, but Ahai knew those old cooling units wouldn't last long without his constant maintenance. During the peak of last summer's heat, the 3rd unit nearly died. It was Ahai who spent the night dismantling the compressor to save it. His uncle understood none of this. He only knew how to crunch numbers and pull strings. Ahai pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. Inside were the numbers of over a dozen boat captains from out-of-town docks, connections he had personally forged during his year on the road. His uncle believed that cutting off the local supply would starve him out, but he didn't realize the sea is vast, and there is more than one pier. As night fell outside the cold storage, Ahai pulled down the rolling shutter and locked up. At 3 a.m., he would drive to a different harbor. He was heading to Nangang Pier, 200 kilometers away, where a captain had promised him a fresh batch of Dongxing grouper. On his 3rd day of business, his mother arrived. She stood at the entrance holding a thermos, her hair looking a few shades whiter than it had during the new year. He was busy taking inventory with Xiao Lin, and for a moment, the sight of her nearly made him drop the ledger right out of his hands. His mother said nothing at first, simply placing the thermos on the table. Inside was his favorite pork rib soup. She looked around the space, taking in the 500 square meter facility and the Haiji Aquatic sign hanging on the wall. To be honest, it was a lot to process. He sent Xiao Lin off to work and pulled up a chair for his mother. She sat in silence for a long time before finally asking if the fallout with his uncle was real. Ahai nodded. His mother sighed, explaining that the uncle had come to the house yesterday and spent 2 hours weeping and complaining. He had called Ahai ungrateful, claiming he had spent a year painstakingly mentoring him, only for Ahai to steal his business and hijack his goods. He told her that Ahai was driving him to ruin. His mother then revealed the real reason for her visit. The uncle wanted her to convince him to quit. He wanted Ahai to sell the cold storage and return to work for him, promising to increase his share to $200,000 a year. Ahai didn't argue. Instead, he reached into a drawer and handed his mother a file folder containing his work records from the past year. Inside was every purchase order, every repair invoice, and a log of every single phone call he had made to chase down late payments. There were also maintenance logs for the refrigeration units, with key moments marked in red. Last July, when the 3rd compressor failed, he had worked 36 hours straight to fix it while his uncle stayed in an air-conditioned room, playing mahjong. In September, a restaurant owed them money. He spent half a month tracking down those 150,000 credits, only for his uncle to say it was simply his duty. In November, a shipment arrived at 2 a.m. He unloaded 3 tons of seafood alone, injuring his back for a month, while his uncle didn't show up until the next day to check the books. As his mother flipped through the documents, her hands began to tremble. He told her that while they officially shared shifts, the reality was quite different. He had done 80% of the work. Out of $5 million in revenue and nearly $3 million in net profit, his uncle had given him almost nothing. He told her he was only paid $20,000 for all that labor. His mother's tears began to fall as she closed the folder and stood up. Without a word, she turned and left. He knew exactly where she was going. At 4 p.m., the sound of an argument erupted from the market. Standing at the entrance of the uncle's stall, she questioned him in front of everyone, asking exactly how much work Ahai had done for that pittance. She demanded to know how he calculated those 12,000 credits. The uncle was speechless at first, before snapping that Ahai was ungrateful. He claimed the stall and the capital were his, so Ahai had no right to ask for more. His mother let out a cold, sharp laugh. She reminded him that when he started the business, 5,000 of the startup capital was a loan from her, a debt he seemed to have forgotten. She asked how he could live with himself, paying a nephew who worked for a year less than a decent wage. The uncle's face turned bright red. He wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. His mother turned to leave, stopping briefly as she passed the entrance of Ahai's cold storage. There was no blame in her eyes, only heartache and a quiet approval. She told him simply to work hard, and that was enough. That evening, Xiaolin officially started her job. We see him teaching her how to inspect the goods and judge the freshness of the seafood. She was a diligent student, taking notes and asking questions. Watching her, he couldn't help but be reminded of himself just 1 year ago. Back then, he truly believed that if he just worked hard enough, his uncle would treat him fairly. To be honest, he had been quite naive. Now he understood that in this world, only your own business is truly reliable. At 11 p.m., the lights were still on at his uncle's stall. Through the glass, we see the uncle sitting alone, staring blankly at the ledgers. Beside him, the refrigeration unit began to make a strange noise. The temperature on the display was flickering, clearly unstable. Ahai looked away and simply locked the door to his own cold storage. He had another shipment to receive tomorrow and couldn't afford any delays. But on the 5th day of business, his supply chain was suddenly cut. He went to the pier at 4 a.m. as usual. Old Zhang's boat had already docked, but when the captain saw him, he merely shook his head. Old Zhang apologized, explaining that the uncle had bought out the entire catch at 20% above the market price. Ahai was stunned. He went to find other boat captains, but after a full round of inquiries, the answer was the same. His uncle had formed an alliance. By joining with 3 other major stalls, the uncle had cornered the local pier supply, outbidding everyone by 20% just to spite him. It was a clear attempt to starve him out. Standing on the empty pier, we see Ahai watching boat after boat of seafood being hauled away. The cigarette in his hand burned down to the filter. When he returned to the cold storage, Xiaolin was already waiting, her face clouded with worry. Seeing him return empty-handed, she looked anxious, but he didn't say much. He simply couldn't afford to give up yet. He remembered a boat captain named Chun he'd met 2 months ago at the New Southern Pier while clearing out some old stock. At the time, Chen's goods were stalled, the quality was good, but the size was small, so local wholesalers refused to take them. Ahai had analyzed the market for him, suggesting he lower the price for retail channels. Within 3 days, the stock was gone. Before leaving, Old Chun told Ahai to call if he ever needed anything. Now, Ahai dialed the number, waiting as it rang for a long time. Old Chun finally answered, his voice thick with sleep. Ahai got straight to the point, asking for any available stock, all paid in cash. Old Chun fell silent for a few seconds, asking if something had happened. Ahai didn't hide the truth about his uncle's blockade. After hearing the story, Old Chun cursed, calling the uncle's behavior disgraceful. He told Ahai to wait for news and hung up. By then, the sun was already up. Instead of going home to sleep, he drove straight toward the southern pier without stopping once. It was 10 a.m. by the time he arrived. Old Chun was already there, standing next to a truck filled with freshly unloaded seafood. Old Chun took him to inspect the goods, a fresh shipment of grouper and hairy crabs that had just reached the port. The size wasn't top tier, but the freshness was undeniable, with bright red gills and strong, lively legs. Ahai made the decision on the spot. He took the entire lot, transferring the 180,000 credit payment immediately. Old Chun checked his phone and patted Ahai's shoulder. He told Ahai he had guts, remarking that men like his uncle would eventually fall. From now on, Ahai would get first pick. They talked for a long while. Old Chun explained that the southern pier was newly developed, and many local wholesalers didn't even know it existed. The supply here was stable, and the prices were 10% lower than the north. Best of all, the captains here were honest people. Deep down, he finally felt a sense of relief. His uncle thought he could kill his business by choking the local pier, but the sea is vast. There is always more than one harbor. Soon, we see him driving the fully loaded refrigerated truck back to the market, where Xiaolin was waiting. When Xiaolin saw the truck, her eyes lit up. We see them working through the night, unloading and sorting the shipment of grouper and crabs. The quality wasn't top tier, but the freshness was unbeatable and the price was lower than the market average. Ahai called several regular customers. After inspecting the goods, they placed orders on the spot. By 10 p.m. that night, over half the stock was cleared, recovering a significant amount of capital. With 15,000 credits back in hand, he drove to the southern pier again the next morning. This time, Old Chun introduced him to 2 other captains. These men ran deep-sea routes, meaning their supply was even more stable. Ahai discussed a partnership, promising that as long as the quality held up, he would pay in cash immediately with no delays. The 3 captains consulted each other before finally agreeing. One of them, a man named Captain Wang, remarked that Ahai had real courage to strike out on his own at such a young age. For men who live at sea, reputation is everything. He told Ahai that if he kept up the cash payments, he would get priority on all their stock. To be honest, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. As he shook their hands one by one, the weight in his heart finally lifted. On the drive back, he received a phone call from Xiaolin. She reported that his uncle had circled the cold storage several times that day. Seeing them unloading goods, his expression had turned quite sour. A few retail traders had even come by to ask where the stock came from and why the prices were so low. Ahai hung up and watched the scenery fly by. His uncle thought that by hiking local prices he could force him out. He didn't realize that the more he blocked the path, the wider Ahai's world became. Once the southern pier supply stabilized, his cost would be 10% lower, giving him an immediate and undeniable price advantage. When that happened, he wouldn't be the one trapped. With the southern supply secured, business at the cold storage finally began to thrive. For a full week, he left for the southern pier at 3 a.m. every morning to collect the goods, making sure to return to the market by 10 a.m. The high freshness and lower prices were a hit. As the retailers got a taste of the profit, the orders began to pile up. On the 10th day, Old Shin called saying he had something to discuss. Ahai didn't hesitate and drove over that very afternoon. Old Shin took him to a food stall at the pier. After ordering a few dishes and pouring 2 drinks, he got straight to the point. He told Ahai he was a reliable young man and that he wanted to sign an exclusive supply agreement. Ahai set down his chopsticks and listened. Old Shun explained that there were currently 5 boats running out of the southern pier. Between him, Wang, and Zhao, they controlled half the supply. He explained that after watching him for a while, they noticed he always paid in cash immediately and was a true professional who never nitpicked. The captains had discussed it and were willing to give him priority, provided he could guarantee moving at least 200,000 credits of stock weekly. In exchange, they would drop his price by another 5%. Ahai calculated the risks. Moving that much volume would be a significant burden. However, securing exclusive supply rights meant controlling the very lifeblood of the trade. While his uncle hiked prices at the local docks to block him, Ahai would be getting the lowest possible prices at the southern pier. This gap would make his advantage undeniable. He looked at Old Shun. They shook hands and signed a 3-month agreement on the spot. Ahai guaranteed the weekly volume, and they guaranteed stability and the best prices. Once the deal was sealed, Old Shin mentioned something else. It seemed someone had been using their connections to sniff around for Ahai's source. They were offering a high price to steal the supply line away. Old Shin looked him in the eye and said that in business, reputation is everything. Since Ahai had been fair to them, they wouldn't dream of betraying him. But he warned the young man to be careful of his uncle. The older man had been in the local market for years and had many tricks up his sleeve. Ahai nodded, keeping the warning in mind. By the time he returned to the market, it was already 9 p.m. Xiao Lin was still in the cold storage, organizing the latest shipment. She hurried over to report that 3 more retail traders had placed orders and a restaurant owner wanted to discuss a long-term partnership. The next morning, we see Ahai visiting that restaurant. The owner, a manager in his 40s, ran 2 successful chain locations in the city. He had always sourced from Ahai's uncle, but lately, the quality had plummeted. Despite several complaints, nothing had improved. Ahai showed him the stock. Boss Lee inspected the goods with a meticulous eye, checking everything from the color of the gills to the clarity of the eyes. Finally, he nodded. He admitted the quality was excellent, but asked if Ahai could guarantee a steady supply. In response, Ahai showed him the Southern Pier Agreement. After reading it, Boss Lee made his decision on the spot. From now on, both his restaurants would source exclusively from Ahai, totaling 50,000 weekly. After seeing Boss Lee out, Ahai stood at the entrance of the cold storage and lit a cigarette. Across the way, at his uncle's stall, a loud argument was breaking out. Through the glass, we see crates of dead fish on the floor, while an angry customer slams his hand on the table. Xiao Lin walked over and whispered that the mortality rate of the fish at his uncle's stall had been unusually high lately. It was a sign. Several refrigeration units were constantly failing, causing unstable temperatures that ruined a lot of stock. Ahai said nothing, simply watching the scene across the way. He knew those specific refrigeration units all too well. The compressor on unit number 3 was aging and required a temperature check every 4 hours without fail. The condenser on Unit 2 had a crack that would easily give out under the heavy load of summer. He had mastered every single one of these quirks. It was only because of his meticulous care that they had managed to keep the fish mortality rate below 3% last year. Without him, his uncle's stall was like a machine missing its vital parts. On the surface, it appeared to be running, but in reality, it had already begun to collapse. That evening, the daily turnover at Ahai's cold storage exceeded 100,000 for the first time. Xiao Lin was thrilled. She showed him the ledger, excitedly declaring that they would definitely turn a profit this month. Looking at the figures, Ahai felt remarkably calm. To be honest, 100,000 was nothing to his uncle, who could move 300,000 a day at his peak. But things were shifting. With the Southern Pier supply stabilized and major clients accumulating, the next step was to systematically eat away at his uncle's market share. Midnight arrived. The refrigeration unit beside him emitted a sharp, jarring noise as the temperature on the display fluctuated wildly. He pulled down the shutter and locked the storage. Another batch of king crabs was due from the Southern Pier at 3 a.m. By the 3rd week after signing the exclusive supply agreement, the daily turnover at the cold storage had stabilized at over 120,000. Then, one afternoon, Old Shun called with a heavy tone. He revealed that someone had approached him offering 20% more than Ahai to buy out the Southern Pier supply. The buyer was his uncle's closest ally. Deep down, Ahai knew his uncle was finally getting serious. Old Shun told him, "Ahai, that price is certainly tempting." However, the captains had discussed it and decided that business is built on reputation. They had signed a 3-month agreement. After all, they couldn't just change their minds on a whim. He was only calling to warn Ahai that his uncle was willing to pay a fortune to crush him. After thanking Old Shun, Ahai drove to the Southern Pier that night. He invited the 3 captains to dinner, but notably, he never mentioned the price war. Instead, they talked about the hardships of life at sea and the current market trends. Old Wang mentioned his son was short on tuition for university next year. Ahai offered on the spot to cover the tuition as an advance payment, which could be slowly deducted from future supply costs. When Zhao mentioned his wife was hospitalized and money was tight, Ahai immediately transferred 50,000 to him, insisting it was for the emergency. We see the three captains looking at him with a newfound respect in their eyes. Old Chun raised his glass, telling Ahai he was a man of his word. He promised that no matter how high his uncle's offer went, they wouldn't budge. Clinking glasses with them, Ahai finally felt a sense of peace. We returned to the market late at night, where he sat in his office calculating. The southern pier was secure, but his uncle wouldn't give up so easily. Since he couldn't sway the captains, he was bound to strike elsewhere. Sure enough, rumors began to circulate through the market like wildfire. Some claimed his goods were smuggled without quarantine certificates. Others whispered that his cold storage was non-compliant and faced imminent closure. There were even claims that his ties to the captains were unstable. These stories were so detailed that customers soon began calling with concerns. He didn't panic, of course. Instead, he took photos of the quarantine certificates, business licenses, and supply agreements for everyone to see. He posted them all to the retail group, and the rumors collapsed instantly. But his uncle wasn't finished. The market management suddenly arrived to inspect. They claimed they had received a report about substandard cooling equipment and demanded he halt operations. Fortunately, Ahai was prepared. Before opening, he had ensured every piece of equipment met the highest standards. Quarantine, fire safety, and environmental permits were all in order. The inspectors spent 2 hours searching but couldn't find a single flaw. They eventually left, looking rather embarrassed by the whole ordeal. As they departed, Shaolin whispered that someone had seen his uncle at the management office filing the report. Ahai simply nodded. He had expected these tactics all along. That afternoon, his daily turnover surpassed 150,000, finally overtaking his uncle's stall. The news spread through the market like a shockwave. Everyone was talking about how young Ahai had truly made it to the top. By evening, a group of creditors had gathered at his uncle's stall to demand payment. To block Ahai, his uncle had been overextending himself. He had been buying local stock at inflated prices and conspiring with other stalls to hike rates, causing his capital chain to tighten dangerously. Combined with a high mortality rate for his fish and a massive loss of clients, his situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Shaolin shared the latest news. She noted that his uncle's number 3 refrigeration unit had failed again, killing an entire crate of king crabs and costing at least 80,000. Ahai knew that number 3 machine all too well. Last summer, when it first malfunctioned, he had worked 36 hours straight to fix it. He knew that machine's every part and every temperamental quirk, but it was no longer his responsibility. That very night, Boss Lee called to say a friend, the owner of another restaurant chain in the city, wanted to source goods from him. The deal was worth at least 70,000 a week. Ahai agreed to visit the next day, then hung up. Standing by his cold storage, he saw the lights still on across the way. His uncle sat alone behind the glass, surrounded by a mountain of bills. His hair seemed whiter, his silhouette aging rapidly. Ahai looked away and locked up. He had a batch of wild yellow croakers to process tomorrow. Customers had already pre-ordered 200,000 worth. Whispers were spreading through the market that his uncle's stall wouldn't last. With those old cooling units failing constantly, the mortality rate of his fish had spiked to 15%. Naturally, many old clients were now turning to Ahai. Shaolin finished organizing the final shipment and noted excitedly that their net profit this month could exceed 500,000. Looking at the numbers, he felt remarkably calm. To his uncle in his prime, that sum was nothing, but to him, it was the first fortune that truly belonged to him. Late that night, as he prepared to head home for some rest, he passed the rival stall and saw his uncle still busy, clumsily trying to repair that number 3 machine himself. He clearly didn't understand the wiring. Ahai watched for a moment, then simply turned and walked away. Once Ahai's daily turnover stabilized at 150,000, his uncle resorted to a desperate price war. Word spread that his uncle was slashing prices by 20%, selling at a loss. Retailers flocked to the stall immediately. Shaolin hurried over to ask if they should lower their prices too. Ahai knew exactly what his uncle was doing. He wanted to drag Ahai down, forcing him to either lose money or watch his customers vanish. But he had miscalculated. Ahai's costs were 10% lower and his supply was more stable. More importantly, he didn't need to fight on price. He sent Shaolin to buy insulated boxes and cooling curtains for the delivery trucks. He was pivoting to a premium service. Shaolin didn't quite understand why they were doing this while everyone else was comparing prices. Ahai just smiled. In the end, it was a game of who would break first. Rather than wasting energy on a stalemate, Ahai chose a different path. For the next 3 days, he didn't drop his prices at all. Instead, he focused entirely on service quality. Before any batch left the warehouse, he personally inspected it to ensure there wasn't a single dead fish in the lot. Delivery times were now accurate to within 30 minutes. If a customer needed goods, they arrived exactly on time, which, as we know, is rare. At first, a few individual retailers were indeed lured away by his uncle's low prices. But very soon, the inevitable problems began to surface. To keep costs down, his uncle started sourcing cheap stock from smaller docks. The quality was inconsistent, and combined with his frequently failing cooling units, The mortality rate of the fish remained stubbornly high. Many retailers realized that while the price looked 20% cheaper on the surface, once they calculated the actual losses from dead stock, they were actually losing money. By the fifth day, those same retailers started coming back to Ahai. They admitted that a slightly higher price didn't matter as long as the quality was stable. He said little, simply providing the same reliable goods and service. Then, Bosley called. He said his friend had finished his inspection and decided to give all his seafood orders to Ahai. This was one of the largest restaurant chains in the city, with a volume of at least 100,000 a week. Bosley mentioned that his friend had actually visited the uncle's stall first, but the stock there was unstable and the mortality rate was too high. Ahai's prices were higher, yes, but zero losses and punctuality were what truly mattered to a restaurant. Ahai met with Bosley's friend and signed a cooperation agreement on the spot. Starting next week, those $100,000 weekly orders would all run through his cold storage. By the time he returned to the market, it was already evening. Several crates of returned goods were piled at his uncle's entrance, and a group of retailers were in the middle of a heated argument with him. His uncle's face was flushed, bright red, and his voice had gone hoarse. Xiao Lin whispered that the returns over the last 2 days had been massive. The compensation alone had supposedly cost him over 100,000. Standing at his own warehouse door, Ahai watched the chaos across the way. The price war had lasted less than 10 days before it began to collapse. His uncle's capital chain was already strained. Selling at a loss while paying for returns was simply unsustainable. But the most fatal blow was the cheap stock he'd bought to lower prices. It had completely ruined his reputation. Many longtime customers had lost all trust in him and were now turning to Ahai. That night, the daily turnover at his cold storage broke 200,000. Xiao Lin excitedly showed him the ledgers, noting that net profits this month could top 800,000. Looking at those figures, Ahai felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Deep down, he knew a price war isn't won by who cuts the deepest, but by who lasts the longest. His uncle thought low. Prices would drag Ahai down, unaware that the true fortress is built on quality and service. Late that night, the lights across the stall were still burning. His uncle sat there alone, buried under a mountain of unpaid bills and return slips. To be honest, it was a grim sight. His phone rang incessantly. Debt collectors, most likely. Ahai locked the cold storage, ready to head home. Tomorrow, a shipment of Australian lobsters was arriving. It was the first order for Boss Lee's friend's restaurant, and it had to be perfect. Walking to the market entrance, he glanced back. In the shadows of the night, his uncle's stall looked particularly desolate. The sign that had hung there for over a decade swayed in the wind, creaking softly. Within the market, whispers had already begun. People were saying the uncle had overplayed his hand. Instead of crushing Ahai, the price war had dragged the uncle himself into the mud. Some even predicted he wouldn't last the month. Ahai didn't join the gossip. He simply focused on his work. The next morning, the Australian lobsters arrived exactly on time. We see him personally inspecting every crate, ensuring the sorting and delivery were handled with absolute precision. When Boss Lee's friend received the goods, he was so impressed that he immediately added another $50,000 order. The price war was effectively over. 3 days later, big news hit the market. Boss Zhang, the owner of the prestigious Jinding restaurant, was hosting his son's wedding banquet. It was a massive event, with 300 tables of seafood required. Whoever secured this deal would cement their standing in the market for years. Boss Zhang's restaurant had been a top-tier choice for 20 years. For nearly that long, he had sourced all his seafood from Ahai's uncle. Their bond was supposedly unbreakable. The banquet was set for Saturday, with preparations starting 3 days prior. The uncle bet everything on this deal, pouring in all his remaining capital and sourcing stock from every dock to stage a comeback. But on Friday afternoon, a shockwave hit the market. Something had gone wrong at Jinding restaurant. Xiao Lin ran over, breathless, reporting that the uncle's seafood was a disaster. Half the king crabs were dead, and the lobsters weren't fresh. Boss Zhang was absolutely furious, demanding an immediate replacement or he would cancel the contract. Ahai watched the chaos from a distance. We see the uncle's stall in utter chaos. He is frantically making calls to source new stock, but it's Friday evening and the banquet begins tomorrow at noon. There is simply no time to bring goods from out of town, and he had already offended the local docks by outbidding everyone earlier. Now, no one wants to sell to him. At 6 o'clock, Boss Zhang arrived at the market in person. He is usually a very mild-mannered man in his 50s, but today his face was grim. Standing at the stall entrance, he shouted that he had trusted the uncle for years, but this quality was unacceptable. With 300 tables of high-profile guests, how was he supposed to explain this disaster? The uncle, drenched in sweat, apologized repeatedly, promising to find a way to restock. Boss Zhang declared that if qualified goods weren't delivered by 10 tonight, their partnership was over. As he turned to leave, he happened to see Ahai standing by the cold storage. He paused, walked over, and asked if he was indeed Ahai. Without wasting time, Boss Zhang asked if he had stock: 50 king crabs, 80 pounds of Australian lobster, and 100 pounds of leopard coral grouper. Everything had to be alive and top tier. Could it reach the restaurant by 10? Ahai did a quick mental calculation. He didn't have enough on hand, but old Chun at the South Pier had just received a shipment. He knew the quality well. Moving goods from the South Pier to the city and then to Jinding Restaurant would be tight, but not impossible. He told the boss he could do it, but first, he had to inspect the goods to ensure the quality was perfect. Boss Zhang stared at him for a few seconds before finally nodding. This was his son's wedding. After all, there was no room for error. Ahai immediately called Old Chun to reserve the day's catch, then grabbed Xiaolin and raced the refrigerated truck to the South Pier. It was already 7:30 by the time they arrived. Old Chun was ready, and we see Ahai personally checking every single piece. He ensured every crab was lively and strong. Once the inspection was finished, they loaded the truck and sped back toward the city. Returning to the market at 9, he and Xiaolin worked through the night, obsessing over every detail. By 9:40, the truck was loaded. They reached Jinding Restaurant at exactly 9:55. Boss Zhang was already waiting in the back kitchen, looking quite anxious. He inspected the goods himself. The king crabs were bursting with life, and the Australian lobsters were pristine, their antennae intact and energetic. The leopard coral grouper was equally impressive, its colors vibrant and its freshness undeniable. Boss Zhang told him he had saved him from a total disaster, but Ahai simply replied it was all in a day's work. The boss looked at him intently and said, "Young man, you've done me a massive favor. Later, I want to talk to you about a long-term partnership." Ahai nodded. By the time he returned to the market at 11 p.m., his uncle's stall was still lit. Through the glass, we see the uncle sitting alone, staring at the piles of dead king crabs and lobsters. His phone sat dark on the table. Boss Zhang had clearly stopped answering his calls. Xiaolin remarked that the uncle was completely finished this time. Jinding Restaurant was a bridge he had finally burned, and there was no coming back from a mistake of that magnitude. Ahai still had to ensure the banquet went perfectly the next day. On Saturday morning, he arrived at the restaurant early. The kitchen was a hive of activity, and we see Ahai personally supervising the preparation of every single seafood dish. The king crab was steamed to perfection, the lobster sashimi was incredibly fresh, and the grouper was tender and sweet. In the hall, Boss Zhang greeted his guests, frequently glancing back at the kitchen with a satisfied smile on his face. At noon, the banquet officially began. Guests at all 300 tables were raving about the quality of the seafood. Several other business owners asked where he got such stock. He proudly told them a talented young man in the market supplied it. By 3 p.m., Boss Zhang called Ahai into his office, ordered tea, and lit a cigarette with a sigh of relief. He admitted that without Ahai, he would have lost all his professional standing that day. He then waved a hand dismissively, mentioning how his years with the uncle had started well, but recently, the quality had plummeted to an unacceptable level. The uncle had become arrogant, refusing to admit mistakes and offering nothing but excuses. This wedding disaster was the final straw. Boss Zhang looked at him and declared that from now on, all his restaurant seafood would come exclusively from Ahai. With 2 locations requiring 200,000 worth of stock weekly, Ahai confidently promised he could maintain the supply. Ahai assured him the quality was guaranteed, backed by a professional cold chain delivery system that promised 0 dead fish and perfect punctuality. Boss Zhang nodded with a satisfied smile, telling him to come by on Monday to sign the formal partnership agreement starting next month. With this deal secured, his cold storage daily turnover would stabilize above 300,000, completely surpassing his uncle's business even at its absolute peak. As he drove back to the market, several phone calls came in from other business owners who had attended the wedding banquet, asking for supplies. He carefully noted down each contact, arranging times to visit them. Meanwhile, rumors were already flying through the market that Ahai was taking off. By 8 p.m., we see him standing at the entrance of his cold storage, looking across at his uncle's stall, where the lights were still burning. The place was empty, save for the uncle sitting alone before a mountain of unpaid bills, looking quite small in the vast, quiet space. He was frantically pressing buttons on a calculator. Xiaolin walked over and whispered that the situation across the way was looking grim. Word was that the uncle had gone to beg Boss Zhang for mercy earlier that day, but the boss hadn't even let him through the door. Others said the uncle was stuck with all the ruined stock from the wedding, facing a loss of at least 300,000. Ahai said nothing. He simply lit a cigarette, knowing deep down that his uncle was truly finished this time. Losing Jinding Restaurant was the final blow. His capital chain had snapped, and between the price war losses and high-interest loans, he simply couldn't hold on any longer. People in the market began to whisper in private that the uncle's stall wouldn't survive the week. It was a harsh reality, to be sure. The next day, Ahai visited the owners he had met at the banquet, reputable restaurateurs with incredibly high standards for their seafood. He took them to inspect his stock and explained his sourcing from the South Pier. To be honest, his professionalism was hard to ignore. Impressed, several owners signed letters of intent on the spot, including Jinding. He now had long-term contracts with 5 major restaurants. His weekly volume now exceeded 400,000. Xiaolin was practically beaming, exclaiming that they had finally made it to the big leagues. Ahai looked at the contracts with a sense of calm. In less than 2 months, he had gone from a 120,000 yuan start to this. He hadn't just found his footing. He had captured the highest quality client resources in the entire market. A remarkable turnaround, by any measure. That afternoon, he headed to the South Pier to discuss increasing supply with Old Chun, who assured him that meeting the demand was no problem. Old Chun explained they had 2 more boats available to ensure a steady supply. By the time Ahai returned to the market, it was already evening. We see a crowd of creditors gathered at his uncle's stall, their voices raised as they demanded their money. The uncle stood there, his hair a mess. His face was pale, and he looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single day. Shaolin whispered that the situation was getting worse. Apparently, the uncle tried for another bank loan today, but was rejected. He now owed over $1 million, a sum he simply couldn't pay back. Ahai didn't join the gossip. He simply returned to the cold storage to work. Tomorrow's shipment was a priority and couldn't be delayed. With the Jinding deal, his daily turnover had stabilized above 300,000. Yet, deep down, he knew relying on a few big restaurants wasn't enough. The small individual retailers were the true foundation of the market. To truly control this place, he would have to bring them together. That afternoon, he invited a dozen retailers he was on good terms with to his office. These were connections he had built over the past 6 months. Some he had helped with emergency funds, others he had assisted when their supplies ran dry. He poured them tea and got straight to the point. He told them that in such a competitive market, it was becoming impossible for small players to survive alone. He had a different vision. He proposed a supply and marketing alliance centered around his cold storage, with unified sourcing, pricing, and delivery. They would stick together and share the profits. The retailers looked at one another, and one finally asked how exactly this would work. It was simple. First, all sourcing would go through him to guarantee the best quality and price. Second, his cold chain trucks would handle delivery. This would reduce losses. Third, profits would be split. He would take 30% and they would keep 70%. A fair deal, by any measure. A retailer named Wang admitted the idea was good, but he worried. What if Ahai used his supply advantage to eventually squeeze them out? Ahai looked at him calmly. He reminded brother Wang that they had worked together long enough for his character to be well known. Besides, if he wanted to crush them, he could do it right now. He wanted an alliance where everyone made money, not a monopoly. Another retailer brought up the uncle. He might be struggling, but he had been in the market for over a decade and still had deep connections. They feared retaliation if they joined Ahai. But Ahai pointed out that his uncle could barely save himself, let alone worry about them. In business, it is strength that matters, not just old connections. The retailers fell silent, weighing the reality of the situation. After discussing it for a while, they all finally nodded. They told Ahai he was a stand-up guy and they were willing to trust him. That evening, an alliance agreement was signed with 13 retailers. Starting next week, all of their sourcing would go through Ahai. Deliveries would be unified using his cold chain trucks. He promised a stable supply, the best prices, and a guarantee of 0 dead fish. Shaolin said excitedly that they had truly integrated the market. Once this supply and marketing alliance began to operate, Ahai would control most of the market's supply and sales. His uncle's market share would be squeezed even further. The uncle's situation was about to become much more difficult. As the alliance officially launched, large shipments were brought in from South Pier. Goods were distributed to members, and delivery trucks arrived exactly on time. Every batch arrived fresh, with not a single dead fish in sight. After seeing the goods, everyone gave a thumbs up, agreeing that working with Ahai was a different league entirely. Word spread quickly through the market that Ahai had become a legend. With over a dozen retailers joining forces to support one another, business began to boom. When the uncle heard the news, his expression darkened. His market share had already been squeezed to almost nothing, and now, things were looking even bleaker for the old man. By integrating the small retailers, Ahai had stripped him of all competitiveness. Shaolin mentioned that the uncle had tried to reach out to them. He had approached several retailers today, hoping to win them back, but no one listened. Some even told him off to his face. They pointed out that Ahai provided stable supply and fair prices, so why would they return? Ahai simply kept working in silence. That afternoon, a call came in from Old Chun. He reported that 2 more boats had arrived at South Pier, making the supply even more abundant. He asked if Ahai could increase his intake, as they needed a steady outlet for the surplus. Ahai agreed without hesitation. With the alliance in place, his sales channels were wide open. He could move any amount of stock now. After hanging up, we see him standing by the cold storage, looking toward his uncle's stall. The older man was in the middle of a loud argument with a creditor. The creditor pointed right at his nose, shouting that debts must be paid without excuses. The uncle's face turned a deep, embarrassed red. He kept explaining, begging for a few more days to find the money. But the creditor wasn't listening and threatened to take him to court. Shaolin walked over and lowered his voice. He had heard a rumor that the uncle was now in even deeper trouble than they thought. The debts he owed had already surpassed $1.5 million. Even if he mortgaged his stall, it wouldn't be enough to cover it. He was truly at a dead end. We see Ahai standing at the entrance of the cold storage, watching the market. It was brightly lit and bustling with people, a scene of pure prosperity. In stark contrast, his uncle's stall across the way looked exceptionally desolate. Shaolin remarked that everyone in the market was talking. They were saying that Ahai was now the true boss of this market, and that his uncle's era had long since passed. Ahai didn't respond. He simply locked the cold storage door. Tomorrow, a batch of king crabs was arriving, and Alliance members had already pre-ordered 500,000 worth. This market effectively belonged to him now. The supply and marketing alliance had been running for 2 weeks, and everything was proceeding smoothly. His cold storage's daily turnover had stabilized at over 400,000, capturing 60% of the market share. Then, one afternoon, while he was taking inventory in the cold storage, Old Chin called. His voice was urgent. The Weather Bureau had just issued a typhoon warning. A super typhoon was set to make landfall in 3 days. All vessels at sea were ordered back to port for safety. This meant that for at least an entire week, there would be no fresh seafood supply in the market. Feeling the pressure, Ahai immediately asked Old Chin if he could still ship goods. Old Chin said today was the final window. Tomorrow, every boat would be docked. He still had one last batch of goods available. He asked if Ahai wanted it. Ahai took it all without a second thought. After hanging up, he grabbed Shaolin and raced toward South Pier. As he drove, he calculated his moves. During a typhoon, market shortages would cause seafood prices to skyrocket. To be honest, it was a massive opportunity. If he could stockpile enough, he could guarantee supply for his alliance and stabilize the market. They reached South Pier just as evening fell. Old Chin and his crew were in the middle of an emergency unloading. Ahai inspected the goods and decided on the spot to take the entire $300,000 load. He transferred the payment right there. Old Chin warned him that this typhoon was a fierce one and he needed to be prepared for a long haul. He estimated the market would be out of stock for at least a week. Ahai nodded, knowing exactly what he had to do, and hauled the goods back. It was already 11 at night when they returned. He and Shaolin began the grueling task of processing and storing the haul. He even checked the backup power. He had to ensure the electricity wouldn't fail during the storm. By the next morning, news of the typhoon had spread through the market like wildfire. Many stall owners were desperately trying to stockpile, but since most boats were already back in port, there was simply nothing left to buy. Shaolin reported that the market was in a frenzy, with prices already up 30%, but Ahai told him not to worry. He prioritized the alliance members' supply first, deciding to wait on the rest. We see him gathering the members for a meeting. He warned them that the typhoon would cut off supplies for a week, but his stockpiles would ensure their business remained unaffected and prices stable. The small vendors breathed a collective sigh of relief. They praised Ahai for his foresight, knowing how close they were to disaster. Without his help, they would have been forced to close. After the meeting, other stall owners approached him offering high prices for his stock. He refused them all, insisting that his alliance members came first. That afternoon, however, he heard some troubling news about his uncle. Shaolin revealed that the uncle had taken out high-interest loans to buy a massive shipment from smaller piers at inflated prices. It seemed the man wanted to use the typhoon to make a killing and settle his debts. Ahai's heart sank at the news. This was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. To be honest, his uncle's ancient refrigeration units were unlikely to handle such a massive load. If those machines failed, the losses would be catastrophic. That evening, we see Ahai stopping by his uncle's stall to observe. The uncle was busy directing workers, a rare smile on his face. His old cooling units were cranked to maximum power, straining visibly. They emitted a piercing, metallic roar. Standing across the way, Ahai watched those aging machines with a growing sense of dread. Shaolin leaned in and whispered that the uncle had stockpiled at least 500,000 worth of goods. It was a staggering amount. He wondered aloud if those broken-down machines could actually hold out. Ahai simply shook his head, offering no reply. That night, he performed a final check on his own equipment. The cooling was steady at -5 degrees, and the backup power was ready. He even prepared several small portable generators, just in case. At midnight, he stood at the entrance of his cold storage, watching the sky. Looking up, we see the sky darkening as heavy clouds gather and the wind begins to howl. The Weather Bureau has issued a warning. A typhoon is coming. It is expected to make landfall the day after tomorrow with devastating force. Across the way, his uncle's shop is still lit up, and we can see him through the glass. He sits there alone among his goods, a hopeful smile on his face. He truly believes this storm is his big chance to turn his luck around, his golden opportunity. He has no idea, of course, that this might be the final straw that breaks him. By the next day, the typhoon draws closer, and the sky turns a bruised, ominous shade. The sky is heavy and gloomy, with winds already reaching gale force. Many stalls in the market have begun closing early to prepare for the typhoon. Ahai has Shaolin check all the equipment once more to ensure everything is foolproof. The alliance members are also ready, waiting for the storm to pass. At 4 in the afternoon, he receives a call from Old Chin, who warns him that the typhoon is even stronger than initially predicted. He tells Ahai to be careful, noting that all their boats have returned to port and the docks are cleared. Ahai tells him not to worry. He is fully prepared. After hanging up, we see him standing at the entrance of the cold storage, watching the sky grow darker by the minute. The wind picks up and rain begins to fall. Across the way, his uncle is still busy, but Ahai notices something concerning. The display on the uncle's number 3 cooling unit begins to flicker, the temperature readings jumping erratically. Deep down, he feels a sudden tension. He knows that machine far too well. These are the telltale signs of an imminent breakdown. Then, the typhoon makes landfall, and the storm sweeps the city. Billboards are tossed about, and trees are snapped in half by the wind. Inside the market, everything is plunged into total darkness. Only a few emergency lights flicker in the stalls. We see Ahai and Shaolin guarding the cold storage, keeping a close eye on the equipment. The coolers are running normally, and the temperature is stable. At 4 in the morning, the market suddenly loses power, and he immediately acts. He starts the backup power, and the lights in the cold storage flicker back to life. He breathes a sigh of relief as the machines resume their hum. This is the benefit of preparing in advance. After all, Xiaolin, peering out the window, suddenly remarks that something seems wrong at the uncle's stall. Ahai walks over and looks through the curtain of rain. The uncle's shop is pitch black, and every single cooling unit has ground to a halt. The man is frantically waving a flashlight around inside, clearly searching for a backup power source that he simply doesn't have. Xiaolin points out that if the power stays out, the uncle's entire stock will be ruined. Ahai says nothing, keeping his eyes on his own equipment. The typhoon rages for 6 long hours before the wind and rain finally subside. As the sky begins to turn white, we return to the market. Ahai steps out to find the market in shambles, littered with debris and standing water. Across the way, his uncle's stall doors are wide open. The man is slumped on the ground, surrounded by piles of dead seafood. The stench of decay is so strong it can be smelled from a distance. Xiaolin remarks that it's all over for the uncle. After 6 hours without power, every single one of his cooling machines has completely given up. Goods worth 500,000 are all dead. He walked over and took a look at the king crabs, Australian lobsters, and coral groupers. They had all turned into a pile of rotting meat. His uncle sat there with vacant eyes, looking as if his very soul had been hollowed out. When the man saw him, a flicker of complex emotion crossed his eyes, but in the end, he said nothing and simply lowered his head. Ahai turned and left without looking back. Returning to the cold storage, he began an inventory. During the typhoon, they had 0 losses. Every piece of seafood was still alive. He immediately notified the alliance members that they could move goods, and by 10, the market reopened. Most stalls had suffered heavy losses due to the power outage and had nothing to sell. In the entire market, we see a stark contrast. Only his cold storage was still running normally. Very soon, the only place with stock was Haiji Aquatic Products, and the phones began to ring. Purchasing agents from major restaurants called one after another, asking for supply. He agreed, but insisted on following the current market rates. After the typhoon, seafood was scarce and prices soared. He prioritized his alliance members at the original price, while others paid the market rate. That day, his cold storage was packed to the brim. Restaurant owners, individual retail customers, and even other stall owners came to him. He supplied them in order, ensuring every customer got something without allowing any hoarding. It was a masterclass in logistics, really. Xiaolin remarked excitedly that their turnover for the day had already broken 1 million. To be honest, it was an incredible feat. Ahai remained silent. This wasn't just about the money. It was the law of the market. The prepared survive, while the unprepared are eliminated. At 3 in the afternoon, several creditors arrived at the uncle's stall. They looked at the pile of dead seafood with grim expressions. One of them pointed at the uncle and shouted, demanding to know how Old Li intended to pay back the money he had borrowed. The creditors refused to listen, threatening that if the debt wasn't paid within 3 days, they would sue and seize his stall. The uncle looked as if all his strength had been drained, leaning against the wall without a word. Xiaolin watched the scene unfold. The boy noted that with 500,000 in lost stock and over 1 million in debt, the uncle would never be able to recover. Ahai stood at the entrance of his cold storage, watching the chaos across the way. Deep down, he felt no ripples of emotion at all. That night, the typhoon finally passed completely. As the sky cleared, he stood at the market entrance, looking up at a sky full of stars. The market landscape had shifted entirely. Across the way, the lights in his uncle's stall were still burning, where the man sat all alone. He remained motionless before that pile of rotting seafood. The refrigeration units were completely ruined, their display screens now entirely dark. They were beyond repair. People in the market began to whisper that this time, the uncle was truly finished. Before the typhoon, he had gambled everything, taking out high-interest loans to hoard stock, only to see it all vanish overnight. Now, he couldn't even stand back up, let alone carry the weight of his mounting debts. The next day, Old Shun called to say that ships were heading back out to sea. New goods would arrive at the port in 3 days. He asked how much stock was needed, and Ahai requested double the previous amount. Market demand was currently massive. After hanging up, he stood at the cold storage entrance and surveyed the market. In the wake of the storm, many stalls were busy tallying their losses, while some had simply closed for good. His own business, however, was doing better than ever. That afternoon, while he was counting new arrivals in the cold storage, Xiaolin approached to say that his uncle was at the door. The man wanted a meeting. Looking up through the glass, Ahai saw his uncle standing outside with messy hair and a face full of stubble. He looked utterly haggard, a shadow of his former self. When the uncle finally caught sight of Ahai, he remained silent for a long time before finally speaking. He asked if Ahai could lend him some money. Ahai just watched him, saying nothing. The uncle continued, explaining that his entire stock was ruined on the night of the typhoon. Now, creditors were at his door every day, threatening to take him to court. He was truly at the end of his rope and begged Ahai to help him, just this once, for the sake of family. Ahai flicked his cigarette ash and calmly asked how much he owed. His uncle lowered his head and admitted that, including interest, it came to 1.6 million. Ahai noted that 1.6 million was no small sum. The uncle looked up, his eyes turning red with desperation. He confessed he knew he had wronged Ahai before, admitting he had been foolish regarding that previous matter of the 120,000. He pointed out that since Ahai's business was now so large, 1.6 million was nothing to him, promising to pay it all back later. Ahai looked at him and asked what he could possibly use as collateral. The uncle froze, then mentioned he still had his stall. Though it wasn't worth much now, the location was still prime. He promised to pay back the principal with interest once he recovered. Ahai simply smiled. "Uncle, do you really think you can make a comeback?" Ahai asked. The question left his uncle choking on his words, his face flushing with a mix of anger and shame. Ahai continued, reminding him that the weather station had issued warnings long before the typhoon. Everyone knew to prepare backup power, yet he chose to ignore it. Instead, he had gambled everything on high-interest loans to hoard stock. "That was your choice," Ahai noted coldly. "Now that things have gone wrong, why come to me?" His uncle stammered, pleading that they were family, but Ahai wasn't moved. "Family," he countered. "You didn't seem to think so when it came time to share the profits." He reminded the man how he had worked himself to the bone for 365 days a year, only to be handed a measly 120,000. Back then, his uncle claimed he was just providing manual labor. "But now that you're in trouble, suddenly we're kin again." The uncle stood there, utterly speechless. It was as if the strength had been drained right out of him. Ahai crushed his cigarette butt and spoke again. "Uncle, I can help you, but I won't lend you money." The uncle's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. "Ahai, just say it. As long as you can help me through this crisis, I'll agree to any condition." The price of help, however, was steep. "Transfer your stall to me," Ahai said. "I'll pay the 1.6 million to clear all your debts in full." The uncle froze, unable to find words for a long time. Ahai pointed out the reality. That stall was currently nothing more than an empty shell with ruined equipment. His customers were gone. Even if he didn't sell, the creditors would eventually take him to court and seize everything anyway. To be honest, it was inevitable. Selling was the only way to clear his name and avoid prison. The uncle's face turned deathly pale, his lips trembling as the weight of the situation sank in. "Ahai, that stall is my life's work," he whispered. "But as we know, sentiment doesn't pay the bills." Ahai remained firm, stating that life's work couldn't buy freedom. He laid out the only two paths remaining: transfer the stall and start over debt-free, or wait for the inevitable lawsuits and the seizure of his assets. One path led to a fresh start, the other led straight to a prison cell. The choice was his. The uncle stood paralyzed, staring at Ahai with a complex gaze. We see a flash of anger and resentment in his eyes, but it quickly dissolved into pure helplessness. "Ahai," he pleaded, "couldn't you offer just a little more?" Ahai shook his head, explaining that 1.6 million was the fair market price. Given the current state of the stall, it was actually a very generous offer. The uncle fell into a long, heavy silence before finally lowering his head. I'll think about it," he muttered. But time, as it happens, was a luxury he didn't have. "Uncle, your creditors gave you 3 days," Ahai reminded him. "Today is already the 2nd day. You don't have much time left to think." Without another word, the uncle turned and walked away. His back was hunched, his steps slow and heavy, as if he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. That very evening, news reached Ahai that the creditors had returned to his uncle's stall. This time, they brought backup and began hauling everything out. They made it clear, if the money wasn't paid by tomorrow, they would take him to court. The uncle stood at the entrance, watching his world crumble. The next day, the uncle returned to see Ahai. This time, he held a document, the property rights to the stall. He stood there in a heavy silence. After a long pause, he finally handed the papers over and muttered that he agreed to the terms. Ahai took the file, glancing over the details. He told his uncle they would finalize the paperwork at the notary's office that afternoon. The uncle nodded and turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked back one last time and told Ahai that he had won. Ahai said nothing, simply watching as the man walked out of his life. By that afternoon, the procedures were complete. Ahai immediately began renovations, connecting the old stall with his cold storage to expand the facility. Standing at the entrance, we see him looking at the stall that now belonged to him. The old sign had hung there for over a decade, but not for long. It would soon be replaced by Hygie Aquatic Products. The day after the agreement was signed, the transformation of the workspace truly began. He hired a professional crew to knock down the partition walls between his uncle's old stall and his own cold storage unit. It was a bold move. The space instantly doubled in size. Ahai ordered 6 brand-new imported refrigeration units, equipped with the most advanced temperature control systems. He even added backup power and increased his fleet to 5 cold chain delivery trucks. This allowed him to serve more customers than ever before. During the renovation, the market was buzzing with gossip. Some said Ahai was ruthless for not even sparing his own uncle. Others disagreed. They argued that if the uncle had treated Ahai better in the past, he wouldn't be in this mess. Ahai, however, ignored the chatter entirely. He focused solely on the progress. A week later, the renovation was finished, revealing a massive 1,000-square-meter facility. It was quite a sight. The 6 new machines were lined up perfectly, and the delivery trucks sat ready at the door. The Hygie Aquatic Wholesale sign shone brightly in the sun. On opening day, he skipped the flashy ceremonies. He simply notified the alliance members and a few of his most important major clients. Among them were the owners of several prominent local shops who came by to offer their congratulations on his rapid expansion. One shop owner gave a thumbs up, amazed that in just a few months, Ahai had managed to consolidate the market so effectively. The alliance members were there too. We see the 13 individual vendors standing in the new stall, looking at the future Ahai had built. Standing at the entrance, we see smiles on every face. They told Ahai that in these 2 months, they had earned more than in an entire year. He simply encouraged them to keep working hard. On opening day, daily turnover surpassed 1.5 million. Orders were backed up from morning until night, keeping the entire team on their toes. The 5 delivery trucks moved back and forth without pause, ensuring every customer received their goods on time. Xiaolin excitedly brought the ledger over to show him the numbers. He told Ahai that at this rate, their net profit for the month could break 3 million. Ahai nodded slowly, processing the weight of that figure. 3 million was what he and his uncle used to net in an entire year. Now, he could achieve it in a single month. As evening approached, the pace finally slowed. He stood at the entrance of the stall, looking out over the entire market. His uncle's old spot was now officially his. It was a strange sort of victory. That night, he gathered the alliance members and core employees for a meeting. He announced that starting next month, he would take only 20%, leaving them with 80%. The individual vendors were stunned into silence. One vendor, a man named Wang, spoke up, clearly unable to believe what he was hearing. He argued that it wasn't right. Ahai provided the supply, the delivery, and took all the risks. Taking only 20% seemed far too little. Ahai replied that since his scale had grown and volume was up, 20% was plenty. He wanted them to earn more so they'd stay motivated. The vendor's eyes grew red with emotion, moved by his generosity. After the meeting ended, we see Ahai standing once more at the entrance of the stall. The market was brightly lit, a bustling scene of people coming and going. It was a picture of pure, frantic success. Then, Xiaolin approached him with some news. He mentioned that the uncle had come to the market today. He had stood at the entrance for a long time, staring at the new stall, but said nothing before leaving. With the 1.6 million, the uncle had cleared all his debts. However, the foundation he had built over a decade in this market was completely gone. He was just an ordinary man now, no longer the high-spirited stall owner he once was. Late that night, Ahai locked up, ready to head home. As he passed the market entrance, he spotted a familiar figure standing there in the shadows. It was his uncle, lingering in the dark. The man stood at the gates, watching the brightly lit world inside. He stared at the Haiji Aquatic Wholesale sign, his expression unreadable and heavy. Ahai walked over and stood beside him in silence. After a long pause, the uncle looked at him, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of regrets. He remained quiet for a long time before finally telling Ahai to do a good job. With that, he turned and began to walk away. Ahai stood at the market entrance, watching his uncle's silhouette disappear into the night. The man's back was hunched, and he walked very slowly now. The high-spirited energy of the former stall owner was gone. In less than 3 months, Ahai had completed a total transformation. He now controlled the largest stall in the market, the most stable supply chain, and the highest quality customers. The market truly belonged to him now. As the year drew to a close, he reflected on how he had started with only 120,000 and a broken family bond. Controlling the entire market now felt like a lifetime ago. That afternoon, he gathered all the employees and alliance members together. He set up over a dozen tables in the new stall for Xiaolin, Old Chun, Old Wang, Old Zhao, and the 13 individual vendors. Everyone who had fought alongside him was there. He stood up, raised his glass, and thanked them all for their unwavering support. It was the day for year-end bonuses, and he was a man of his word. Xiaolin was the first to receive his, a thick red envelope. Inside was 200,000. Though his monthly salary was only 12,000, Ahai had promised a bonus for good work, and he certainly delivered. The 13 vendors also received their shares. As agreed, the profits were split 80 to 20, with the vendors taking the lion's share. Each of them received hundreds of thousands, some even over 1 million. Xiaolin and the vendors were so moved they were speechless. In the past, they had worked themselves to the bone for others just to earn 100,000 a year. With Ahai, they earned more in months. He assured them that as long as they followed him, they would be well taken care of. Next year, he promised, would be even better. Old Chun and the other boat captains arrived as well. He had prepared generous gifts for each of them to thank them for their loyalty. Old Chun patted his shoulder, remarking that Ahai was a man of honor. It seemed they had placed their bets on the right person. As the wine flowed and the atmosphere grew lively, the vendors began to reminisce about the struggles of the past few months. They admitted that, at first, no one in the market believed a young man could outmaneuver his uncle. They were wrong, of course. The situation had completely reversed in a remarkably short time. By the time the banquet ended, it was already late at night. Xiaolin approached him at the stall entrance with the ledger. Total turnover since opening was 23 million, with a net profit of 8.5 million. Ahai flipped through the numbers. Last year, working for his uncle, the total turnover was only 5 million with a much smaller profit. Back then, he only took home 120,000. Now, in less than 3 months on his own, his profit was triple what the entire business made last year. He had come to understand a great deal about the world, mainly that rules and power are only real when you hold them in your own hands. His uncle once claimed the stall, the capital, and the connections were all his, so he made the rules. Now, the stall belonged to Ahai. The supply chain and the customers were his now, too. He held the power, but he refused to be like his uncle, who chose greed and exploitation. That path had left his uncle isolated. Ahai's goal was different: ensure everyone following him prospered, for that is how one truly goes far. Shaolin mentioned that the uncle was now working as a kitchen hand in a small restaurant. From market boss to manual labor, it was quite a fall. It was a staggering drop in status, one most people couldn't bear, but it was the result of his own choices. He was simply reaping what he sowed. At midnight, we see him locking the stall doors as the New Year's bells prepare to chime. Throughout the market, the celebrations began. Firecrackers began to pop in the distance. He stood beneath the Haiji Aquatic Wholesale sign, looking over his 1,000-square-foot empire. He looked at the 6 brand-new refrigeration units and the 5 cold chain delivery trucks parked outside. From 120,000 to 8.5 million. In less than 3 months, he had transformed from an exploited worker into the market's largest supplier. It was a productive year, to say the least. He had learned the most important lesson of all: true confidence only comes when you are the one in control of the rules. Shaolin walked over to wish him a happy new year. Ahai smiled back, returning the sentiment as the first fireworks began to bloom. The sky erupted in colors, illuminating the entire market. Standing at the entrance of his stall, he watched the display with a sense of profound peace. Next year, he planned to expand even further, moving beyond this market to dominate the surrounding cities and perhaps even further. But for now, his only wish was to go home and share a New Year's meal with his mother. He pulled out his phone to send her a message. "Mom, I'm coming home tomorrow," he wrote. Her reply came almost instantly. "Good, I'll be waiting for you." He tucked his phone away, locked the gate, and drove out of the market, leaving the glowing Haiji Wholesale sign shining brightly in the night.